thanks to recording in progress. Very good. Got it. Okay, good. Yes, and thanks, Zoltz and John, everybody at Sooner Safer Happier for allowing me to share some of the experiences from myself and our crew back at Best Buy about our agility journey. And one of the core purposes of Best Buy as a company is to enrich lives through technology. And that's what we aspire to do for our customers and our employees, though today my life is not necessarily enriched because, as you may have heard, as I attempted to join the Zoom on my work laptop with my beautiful presentation, trust me, it's just gorgeous and eye-catching. For some reason, my computer crashed, and I've been spending the past 10 minutes frantically trying to get it connected, and my life is not currently enriched. But thankfully, I'm competent at speaking, and hopefully, you're all good at visualizing. So, I joined Best Buy about 2.5 years ago, and I joined with the charter of helping to continue to advance this journey, a journey to embrace agility and to adopt product management and a product model of working, which is something that Best Buy had been on the path of doing prior to my arrival. In fact, when I showed up, there were a variety of different parts of the digital organization within that company who were already applying agile practices. There was product management happening, and there were a lot of changes happening in the company as they were continuing to evolve how to bring business and technology together. They had a relatively new chief digital and technology officer who had brought together the technology and digital organizations into one, which, for lack of a better term, think about more traditional IT, more waterfallish ways of working coming together with some of the customer facing teams that had been playing around with these notions of dedicated, durable teams focused on customer needs. So it was an exciting time to join the company. And when I joined, we really rallied around this mantra of aligned autonomy. Now, many of you have probably heard that talked about from Spotify. In fact, there's some really cool videos out there on the internet where I'll probably pronounce the guy's name wrong, but Heinrich Nieberg, that guy, he draws some really cool illustrations, and he shows this 2x2 where they have a vector of alignment and a vector of autonomy. And the notion here is we want to get to that place where we're highly aligned, where leaders have figured out the most important problems to solve, and teams have the autonomy to solve it. They find the right ways to solve it. And I know from my own past experiences, prior to Best Buy, for example, I worked at Target, and we worked on a lot of agility and product management evolution there. You go through fits and starts a lot of times as a company as you're trying to seek that promised land of aligned autonomy. Sometimes the pendulum swings one way and you find yourself in this place where you have high alignment. You've sort of processed the heck out of every dimension of what could possibly be delivered, and leaders are communicating both the problem to be solved and also how to solve it. But of course, the problem you run into is then teams are unable to adapt to customer signals, and oftentimes feeling like they are in a place of inflexible assumptions. And I've also experienced where the pendulum swings to sort of a rogue state where you have tons of teams that are iterating rapidly into separate, potentially not valuable corners of the company. So we really were striving to align around this aligned autonomy concept, this notion of having strong clarity around the most important problems to solve and pushing the decisions to the people closest to the information so the teams would have the autonomy to make the right choices. So to get there, when I started, I was really tasked with doing two things. One was establishing a central coaching organization. There had been lots of great coaches doing great work at Best Buy up until that point, and they were generally engaged by individual groups or teams, and there was quite a nice range of coaches across the company. But the dream was that we would bring them together into one centralized coaching organization so that we could both attract, hopefully retain, and develop great talented coaches who could be positioned neutrally to really balance ways of working. Sometimes I know I've experienced in other companies reporting up where coaches actually report into engineering or product management. And that can work sometimes. But our bet was what if we position those coaches to report up to people who were coaches themselves and could be better positioned as these neutral arbiters of ways of working, these facilitators who could really reach across the aisle. So that was one portion, establishing the coaching team. The second portion of what I was asked to do as I joined Best Buy was to establish a product management, product model community. Now, Best Buy uses the term community of practice, and I think the way they use it is potentially a little bit different than what I'm familiar with in the industry, in that Best Buy both wanted to foster an opportunity for people to share their learnings across product management roles and roles in product teams, which is consistent with what you might think of as community of practice. But there are also very tactical, specific asks of this. For example, they wanted a group to come together and really codify the job family, the responsibilities, and the levels of product management at Best Buy. They wanted to both experiment with new ways of working and also try to align on what are some of the common practices. Back to the aligned autonomy, what are some of the places and ways that we will commit to being aligned, and where are we going to flex? So this product community and the coaching group really became the two sides of the coin for how we wanted to support and advance our ways of working in our model at Best Buy. So our coaching team came together and thought about what is the most valuable way as coaches we can focus our energies and support the groups that we work with day in and day out. And we came up with three themes that have really been sort of the rallying cry for us. Those three themes are around increasing partnership across business and technology, focusing on the highest value work and helping other teams have a shared focus, and improving product flow. To remember those, we created this phrase, our business is focused and flowing, and that mantra has been sort of our reminder of these three elements: increasing partnership with business and technology, focusing on the highest value, and improving product flow. And that has really been what's been guiding our coaching team, particularly over the last year, as we support Best Buy's digital and technology organization. So with that backdrop, I was going to talk to you then about specifically our coaching organization and how we've operated and worked, as well as our product community of practice. And since, sadly, due to technology issues, I don't have visuals that could make this even more engaging and enriching, and I drew some of the pictures myself, so boy, it's really, really a shame you don't get to see this wonderful work. Maybe I'll do a couple pauses along the way and get a few questions and discussion points, if that's all right with Zoltz and Ann. I see the nod, so I'll take a little pause here. So I gave you kind of the broad stroke overview before I dive into coaching and the product community. What questions jump to mind? And maybe, I'm not sure how you typically do this, but potentially raise a hand or just start blurting out.
I have one question here. In terms of, you mentioned the communities of practices. So how do they organize? So how the communities of practices are organized?
Well, at Best Buy, and again, I will admit, Best Buy uses the term community of practice, I think, a little bit liberally, and in some cases, the way that these groups of people come together and what they do potentially deviates from industry. But as a starting point, Best Buy identified a few different areas where they wanted to foster shared learning and the evolution of ways of working. So they started with product management, so that's the community, and maybe you could say even sort of a pseudo COE that we've started and support. We have a group that's focused on data and analytics. We have a group that's focused on engineering and architecture. And there is a group also focused on program management and how does that evolve as we evolve how we work and how we're organized. Now within that, those big buckets of folks, they do kind of subdivide. And I'll talk a little bit in more detail about how in the product community, we've sort of subdivided our focus and some of the maybe truer to the definition in the industry sort of communities of practice that have emerged within that and how they're focused, and as well as some of the other ways that we've kind of rallied around getting a shared understanding of product management, what that means for the company.
Thank you so much. We have two additional questions in the chat regarding to the same. So COPs, it sounds like that's a popular theme. So how to get participants engaged in COPs? That's one question from Sam. And then from Chuck, there is a question. Would you say that your communities of practices were also form of enablement teams?
All right, well, I'll start with Sam's question first. Getting participants has been an interesting and ever-changing process. When I first showed up, there was a lot of energy and hubbubaloo about this thing that was new to Best Buy. Hey, we're standing up these communities, and so there were a lot of people that were very interested, and it was great. We got a lot of folks engaged and signed up, and I'll speak in a moment about we kind of identified kind of three primary groups that were focused on some different specific areas, and we were able to kind of move people to the place of interest. And over time, people have their day-to-day work, and things get busy, and things kind of wane in terms of engagement and participation. And we would try to do reboots every 6 to 12 months, where we'd sort of reach out and try to re-engage with the community, and try clever things here and there, like bring in John Smart to do a speaking engagement, and suddenly a lot of people are like, yeah, we want to be part of the COP, and doing other sort of external events to kind of get energy. But it has been an ongoing process to reflect and adapt to how do we continue to get participants in engagement, because it is volunteer at the end of the day for the community of practice and the community groups at large. I've found that generally if we have some pretty clear and interesting problems to solve, we've found people who are very interested. So for example, we have a group that focuses on talent. Now, I can talk more about that in just a moment, but there's some folks who are very passionate about talent. So we've had a few people really step up and kind of lead some of those groups because of personal interest and aptitude. And oftentimes when you have passionate and engaged people, it's contagious, and maybe that's a bad analogy to use these days. It is influential, and other people jump on board and get involved as well. So some of the key has been finding people who are really engaged in some of these problem spaces and areas of focus, and by proxy of their energy, they bring people along. So in terms of, would I say that our community of practice are also a form of an enablement team? Depending on one's definition of an enablement team, I think just based on the word, I would say to some degree, yes, in that, our communities in practice are there to help people oftentimes learn about new practices, share across. I think our coaches in many ways are like an enablement team, because our coaches are there to help people learn about and put into practice new ways of working. So enablement, I think, can take many forms, but I do think across our coaches and some of these working groups and some of these communities, there certainly is an enablement component to it. It is oftentimes more than simply sharing ideas and experimenting. In some cases, we've created things, like an example being, we created what we called a product management skills framework. We did all these working sessions to try to identify what do we feel are the most important and valuable skills for product managers to have at Best Buy, drawing from the industry, our own lived experience, and the thoughts of the folks in the group. We really distilled it down into a set of different skills and aptitudes, and we even broke that out into different tools that we could use, tools that managers could use to have development conversations with product managers who they supported, ways that product managers could do their own sort of evaluation based on these skills, and then created a product library of everything from books to blogs to YouTube clips to groups like this, where people could get involved and learn more. And so in that way, the community was creating a path for enablement for the hopefully evolution and development of product management skills. So there is an enablement component to it, I would say. And apologies,
Neil,
my dog is snoring in the background.
I was just going to say that. Yeah. So that snoring noise, I've spoken to you enough times, Neil, that I know that snoring is your dog. So it's not somebody on the call. He's not on mute snoring. It's Neil's dog.
Yes, thank you for that, John. This is just the perfect day for me. I'm so excited for this thing, and my computer crashes, my dog shows up and starts snoring on the call. This is par for the course for me. All right. Well, why don't I move on and start to do a deep dive into our coaching approach? So, for our coaching team, we broadly look at ways of working. Think of routines and artifacts and practices. How do we help groups adopt and evolve, continuously improve how they're working and the effectiveness and efficiency of that? Our coaching group looks at the system of work. You know, how is everything flowing? You know, how are we thinking about value and organizing around that? Even notions of team taxonomy becomes part of what our coaches think about and work with the groups that they support to consider. And of course, culture is a big part of our coaching approach. Principles, mindset, helping us to actually get into a growth mindset and continuously reflect and adapt on how we're operating, how we work with one another. We follow a few rules that help guide our decisions, and one of the things that carried over from my previous gig, and we talk about it some with our coaching group, is this notion of the vampire rule. So, if you're familiar with vampires, and if you're not, this is actually a good tip for you. They actually can't enter your house unless you invite them in. So for them to cross the threshold, you have to be foolish enough to invite them into your house. Now, vampires are tricky, coaches are not. But what we try to take from this is, I think what John often describes as invite over inflict. So for us, the vampire rule is one of the main guiding rules for our philosophy of both how our team was set up and how we operate. We want to have a pull. We want people to want coaching in order to enter their zone and work with them. And that's reflected in how we actually allocate coaches. So in Best Buy's digital analytics and technology organization, we currently have, let's say, in the neighborhood of 7 to 8 macro portfolios of work. And being a big company, as you can imagine, those get sort of slightly redefined and reorged every year or so. In fact, we're right in the process of sort of rethinking some of that. But for the purposes of this example, in those different sort of macro portfolios, these big groupings of engineering teams and product managers that are aligned to a specific focus, they have budgets and headcount. So if they decide that they want coaching support, they're actually the ones who allocate the headcount and the budget. They will, come to our group and they'll say, hey, we represent, as an example, the omni-channel portfolios of Best Buy's digital organization, and we want some coaches. Here's some headcount, here's some money, we'll have some discussions, and ultimately those coaches, though reporting up through our centralized team, positioned neutrally to be those facilitators, are funded and their headcount comes from that group. Now, the pro and con of this, of course, is that the people that invest in coaching are the people that get coaching, and it took us a little while to get to this state within our org. The con, of course, is that we are, I don't want to say at the mercy of, but we are in service to their needs and their funding. So, if we're like, hey, we actually think we need more coaches here, we'll have that conversation, but at the end of the day, they get to decide when it comes to headcount and funding. So it's a nice way to ensure that we're being invited in, and I think we're continuing to work through the nuances of, how do we adapt to change in a way that ensures we have the appropriate level of support. So I'm going to pause there because I see things happening in the chat. Some questions coming through. Things we want to chat about?
Observations, I think, Neil.
Anybody any
Hey,
questions?
Neil, this is Drew. I can jump in. I did just post a question. And I was thinking I was going to chime in your last little pause. Great stuff, by the way. I really appreciate your.
If only you could see the
your
visuals,
style.
you'd love this.
Well, no, but I've been through this so many times. I think we all have. So we all get it. I'm picturing it in my head right now. When we think about changing that model from, because maybe coaches are assigned maybe at a function area or at a domain level or whatnot, and then we kind of shift that paradigm into, hey, we're going to build a coalition around our coaches, and we almost inadvertently or maybe purposefully make it like a shared service model, how did you find that to change the influence of the coaches, and how did you find it to change the ability for the coaches to come together and start to build out like that practice amongst themselves, so now they can kind of reach out into those different aspects with a more consistent, unified approach, as opposed to it being disparate?
Yeah, that was, if I'm tracking with your question correctly, one of the motivations of having the central coaching group was to kind of find that balance about how can we get commonality, how can we get that aligned element, and then have enough localized empathy, experience, and knowledge to balance that with the autonomy. And it's, I won't pretend like we have an exact perfect equation for it, but I will maybe share the next step of the coaching story here, which is we have created something that we call coaching units. So within a given area, let's say a set of portfolios, and they give us money to invest in coaches, we will have a group of coaches that we call a unit that are dedicated in that area. And we have lead coaches who support those coaches. Those coaches report up to them. They try to locally identify what are their improvement outcomes, what are the things that they're going to work with that group. But then we do have, of course, leads that are leading these units, supporting those units of coaches across all of these different portfolios. And we've experimented, and actually I think we have a couple of the leads on the call here, at least I saw Joe. We've experimented with how do we bring those leads together to strike that balance, so we do things like we share these unit updates where each unit lead will come in and they'll say, here's what we're doing in our area, here's how we're showing improvement. And sharing that across helps give us some sense of commonality. Joe, what are some of the things you'd share? Because you've done a lot of work to both show how your units are improving as well as how you've worked across leads. I think you're on mute. Or maybe you don't want to share, which is fine. I don't mean to put you on the spot. I just see your face, so I thought maybe you were. Nope. Best Buy sells great technology. Sometimes the technology we use for our employees is, we try to pass on the savings to our customers, really. We use some of the used equipment ourselves. Joe, are you still trying to get off mute? Oh, there you are. Nope.
No, I think that was me, which still drove.
Oh.
But I wanted to at least say what you said resonated. I'm literally doing the same thing, but I'm not quite there yet. I'm not that far along, but I'm trying to create the thing. So then I can bring people on to build the thing. And it takes time. But everything that you're saying is sort of that's how I've been trying to map it out, when I believe and what I've seen has worked in previous gigs. We've done the same, I think. Anyway, so it's nice to hear the model and to hear the success. And I understand it's always a work in progress. So you've never.
Yeah, we're in the process right now of adapting to change as there are some new structures coming together in our digital analytics technology organization, and we're going to be looking at all this again and saying, like, how do we make sure that our coaches, our units are aligned to value and can best support our organization as it stands. And one of the other guiding principles, I guess, or informal jokey things that helps us make choices is another rule that we call the Dolphin Rule. So dolphins, of course, are mammals. They breathe air, but they live in the water. So the Dolphin Rule for us is you can dive down deep, but you always have to come back up for air. And we use that to mean a few different things. But one of the things when it comes to coaching allocations is that even with our coaching team, and I think right now we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 40-ish coaches across Best Buy's digital analytics and technology group, give or take a few. And even with that many coaches, even with these units, just the ratio of coach to teams is not 1-to-1. Like if we had 1-to-1, we would have like a team of 300 some coaches, and I don't think we get that quite that much funding from the organization. Maybe someday, who knows? But with the Dolphin Rule, it really applies. So, for example, we've got an area where we've got, let's say, 8 coaches across 45 teams. And so, in some cases, we'll make choices based on need, pull, bright spots that we see that we want to amplify, where coaches will be focused on, of those 45, they might be focused on a handful of teams. But there might also be needs more broadly, like, hey, this whole portfolio would benefit from understanding outcomes over output, or we all would benefit from understanding, insert concept that broadly could be helpful. And so in that case, as a Dolphin, they might, come up for air, look across all the 45 teams and say, you know what, we have this need to kind of provide this level of support through group facilitation, potentially training offerings or workshops. But then, they do go deep in some cases with teams, but they don't only live there. And in many cases, it's kind of the old adage of teach them how to fish. Sometimes coaches will, work very intensely with a handful of teams, get them to get practices, and then try to get to the place where potentially they can be self-organizing, and then they can move on. And as you can imagine, it's more art than science. And in some cases, our coaches stay for a very extended period of time with specific dedicated teams. And in some cases, we take a very much broader approach. But our mantra remains the same. You can always get down deep, but try to always come up for air as well. Kind of look across the landscape and take the broader view. All right, now I can transition to our product communities next, but I'd be happy to pause and talk a little bit more about coaching if you'd like. There might be questions I missed in the chat.
I kind of dumped it in the chat, but a quick question. Do you feel like your coaches enter these engagements, do you have any kind of contracts or areas of focus or anything like that, or metrics or you were trying to get to as a way to kind of measure approach? As a consultant, we always felt like we were obligated to have kind of, this is what we expect to get, this is our areas of focus. So I was kind of curious if an internal model gets on somewhere or not.
Yes, good question. So we've got an artifact that we call the collaboration support agreement. That is something that we establish at the unit level. So when coaching leads and their units are engaged, and that is where they define let's call them the improvement outcomes for that engagement. And I mentioned briefly earlier that we do these unit updates where the coaches come together and we invite some of our constituents. We talk about how are we progressing relative to those improvement outcomes we've defined with in those collaboration support agreements. One of the things that we continue to explore is how do we do that across our entire group? How do we do that for the digital analytics and technology organization? And I will say that we don't necessarily have an exact singular contract for the totality of digital analytics and technology. We have the themes I mentioned earlier, which are the foundation of a lot of these improvement outcomes, which is bring business and technology together, trying to improve product flow, and being aligned around a shared understanding of the highest value work. So those 3 areas are sort of a common touchstone for these collaboration support agreements. And we have gone through some exercises with our senior leadership of the digital technology organization to really try to align around what are the big, longer, let's say multi-year objectives and key results of change. What are our outcomes of change that we want to anchor to? Because we feel like as a community practice, that would give us a really nice way to correlate, our improvement outcomes to something that is being communicated more broadly. And I will say that we've taken a pass at that with leadership, and we try to connect to it. It's not yet to the point where I think it could be as powerful as I imagine it to be. I think it could be even more concise. But those are the kinds of connections we try to make to tell the story of how we're improving and how we define and align on those outcomes. So just to recap in a slightly less blathery way, we have the collaboration support agreements, unit coaches and their specific engaged areas defined. We loosely use the 3 themes as a guidepost for that, and we're trying to get crisper on the broader organizational multi-year outcomes of change to hopefully provide a very clear connection to our evolutionary goals in terms of ways of working.
Awesome, thanks.
Other questions on the coaching stuff? My dog woke up right now, so oh no, never mind. Thought he was. All right. Well, I'm going to move on to the product community and talk about the other half of my coin. And so, speaking of potentially silly sounding rules to live by, we have this term that is caught fire in a few areas called Picassoing. It actually originated from our coaches, and now I hear it being used by a lot of our product managers. And where this comes from is there's a quote which is attributed often to Picasso, though the more I read about it, it might not actually be his, but we're going to go with that. And it's something to the effect of, good artists borrow, great artists steal. And we were talking about that originally as a coaching group, and we're like, you know what, we love to steal from each other. You know, one group does something, I'm going to take that. And so then we started to say, hey, I'm Picassoing that from Joe, or I'm Picassoing that from Mark. And this, in the communities, this started to come through, and now I've heard a lot of our product managers saying, I'm going to Picasso that. And I bring it up in the context of the product community because it's now coming up more and more through some of our groups, because many of our groups are all formed to bring people together to share ideas and see what they can steal from one another. We've got three primary groups for our product community. We've got a product management practices group. And as you can imagine from the name, they're really there to try to improve the effectiveness of what we call product practices by sharing what they've experimented with, exploring what might scale, what might not, and again, trying to Picasso shamelessly from one another. We've got a product group that's focused on talent. This is the group that maybe, you know, is on the spectrum closer to like COE than COP, because this is a group that actually has some organizational, let's say, accountabilities. For example, this is the group we brought together to author, refine, and codify the product management job family, like literally what HR uses at Best Buy to level and determine the responsibilities of different product management roles. They also created that skills framework I mentioned, and right now they're working on different experiments of how to provide inroads for internal folks that are interested in product management and work at Best Buy, but don't know where to start. So they focus on those kinds of things through this talent group. And then, arguably the most nebulously titled, there's a communities and forum group. And what this does is they experiment with how do we build different internal communities and connections to external communities. So they do everything from, they've created some really interesting interaction models for people to get engaged with one another. For example, they've established these things called product cohorts. So they're smaller groups of folks that are either product managers or product management interested. They meet on a regular basis. They're self-led. They get to know each other. They provide informal mentoring and learning, and they kind of operate on their own kind of cadence. We also have things called share and learns, which are kind of broader, where we bring together and invite the extended product community, and people will present specific things like, hey, I went to, you know, the business agility conference, and this is what I learned, and then there's some discussion. We also have things called product friends, which is really sort of a lean coffee, very fluid sort of format where people come in, share topics rather organically. And we also have this library that I referenced earlier, which is sort of this archive of references and materials that this group maintains. So those are the three areas as they currently stand in our broader product community. And again, our goal is to learn from one another and never be afraid to shamelessly Picasso from one another as we learn and explore new and good things that can be applicable in other places. So I'll pause again. Questions, thoughts of our product community?
Have a knowledge management platform that you use to capture all these communities of practice and everything that's you've learned?
I'm sorry, I believe your question was, it cut out a little bit for me. Did you say, is there like a platform that we use?
A knowledge management platform, like almost like
Oh,
an
gotcha.
intranet to knit all these groups together.
Gotcha. Yes. Well, what we use is honestly a little bit Frankenstein. We have Atlassian tools, so we've got Confluence. So we do have these sort of a network of Confluence pages where we try to hopefully there's a lot of opportunity to make it cleaner and maybe more organized, but we try to present everything through Confluence. We also use Miro as a visualization tool. So there are lots of things where we will link, if there are things that we feel like are better represented in sort of that virtual whiteboard, if you will, we try to connect Confluence to that. We used to experiment with SharePoint because we have a lot of Microsoft stuff, and had some pros and cons with that. So we're still, I think, on the journey to see if there's maybe a nice platform or system that would be a little bit more intuitive. But today it is kind of a hodgepodge of Confluence and Miro.
Thank you.
I see in the chat that my friend Joe Cheravino, one of our illustrious coaches, left and came back, and mute might work. Joe, did you want to interject with anything that you weren't able to share earlier?
Sure. Yeah, sorry about that. I had to come back
Oh,
around.
no.
Neil mentioned Picassoing. I'll add a little bit to that. When we do that and we take another's work, something that's been really powerful is we customize it for context. So we might take a training or a workshop, and then we can take that sort of lift and shift, and then we'll fine tune it for a local audience. And we've kind of applied that technique across the different units that Neil mentioned, and it's worked really well.
Good call out.
That's really interesting. I'm interested to know how you maintain that. How do you maintain your knowledge base over time so it remains, fresh and up to date?
Well, I think this would be another question I'd be curious to hear Joe's thoughts on. I would say, in terms of just as individuals, one thing that's really exciting about our group of coaches in particular, and many of our product managers as well, is folks are by and large very engaged and voracious learners. And we do everything from, obviously as individuals, people have the opportunity to go to conferences and seek out trainings, but we try to support that internally as well. Again, we've brought John in to speak both with our leaders and do a couple presentations. We try to do workshops with other folks that we respect in the industry. So, we've brought in folks like Jeff Patton to do workshops in the past, both broadly across our communities and org, as well as in more focused areas. And we have some local product management and agile folks that we've brought in as well for events, be them, again, large scale or smaller. And I mentioned the product library. We do try to continue to build out internal resources and reference points so that people have a lot of different things to choose from. And we've also done a lot of book clubs and stuff. So we recently had a book club focused on the book Team Topologies. Prior to that, we had a book club around Sooner, Safer, Happier. So and these become facilitated book clubs where it's not simply reading the book and just talking about it, but bring groups together for facilitated discussions about how does it apply to your work. And those have been pretty well attended and quite engaging, and it actually led to things that we can see show up in our ways of working, whether it's adoption of common terminology. I mean, I will say, like, the language of Sooner, Safer, Happier is now something you hear everywhere from senior leaders to people on teams talking about. Where things, some of the team topologies stuff potentially might get to the same level. So those are some examples. Joe, again, not to put you on the spot, but since you're here, anything you'd share about that as well?
I think that's an area of improvement for us in terms of going back to the original question around, I think, like maintenance and how do we maintain that? It's very easy. We sort of have all this great content sort of floating out there in the ethos. And I was just talking about this to somebody this morning, like, you can do a search for it quick, but you have to remember where, what that was. And so we've got a lot of great content out there, but we're at a point where we need to start sort of cataloging some of that and sort of highlighting our greatest hits, I think, for as new coaches or other people go to access it, we have a way to kind of index that and go after the highest value stuff that's out there.
Yeah, I suspect many are in a similar position. Sorry, that was a very librarian type question. I am a librarian at heart, as well as being a project manager. Thank you.
Yeah. Looking through the chat, I see there was a question from Ryan that we skipped over, recommendations for coaching certifications. Ryan, what I would say is we're kind of an agnostic Agile crew in that, we value all potential Agile learning and probably subscribe to nothing exclusively. There are coaches across our group that have been certified in different areas, and one of the things that we've talked about, and we haven't actually done it, is whether or not there's a value internally to create some of our own kind of best by certifications that would help people feel confident and that they have effectively gone through some of the different phases of learning and application that we've identified being valuable. We have created our own internal curriculum around things like, we have these courses called like Agile Core and Kanban Core and Product Management Core and things that, and the different sort of layers of that, though I guess we don't technically have our own certifications. But we focused, I think, a lot on, what are the common learnings that we want to support within Best Buy, and then encourage our coaches to, get whatever certifications they feel are relevant. And like, for example, I hate to keep throwing out there, Joe, but you're here and I see your face, but like, you're going to be doing some training coming up this summer, and you're the only coach that signed up for that. But the hope would be, you're going to go there, you're going to learn some great stuff and can bring it back, and we can hopefully cross-pollinate and learn, even if everybody doesn't go through it.
Yeah, it's Craig. It's Les with Craig Larman. So I'm looking forward to bringing that back to the group.
And I see Mark had a question about how much time do you spend on each book for book club? It has varied on a couple things. Generally, what we do is we try to chunk it up. We usually take chunks of the book. So rather than saying like, we're going to read the whole book and talk about it, we've tried to take sort of a iterative approach. Imagine that. So for example, we'll say, hey, we're going to read chapters 1 and 2, and then we're going to come together and talk about, themes. What do we learn? What is applied? And we've had some different folks in our gang facilitate through these. So it has varied depending on the length of the book, but we typically see them as, really trying to slice it apart into pieces. And I can't remember off the top of my head if for team topologies it went chapter by chapter. I don't think it did. I think it was maybe 4 sessions, but we try to break it down so that we increase maybe the focus of the conversation and sort of narrow the amount of content that people have to consume ahead of time. And in some cases, like for Sooner, Safer, Happier, we probably have done, I think we did at least 2 or 3 different versions of book clubs with that, and each one was divided up a little bit differently. But we, I think the common approach for us is just kind of experiment with how to chunk it out, and then how to make sure there's not enough time in between that you lose too much memory and context.
We were very fortunate for the Sooner, Safer, Happier book club we did, where for those that maybe didn't read the chapter that week, we had John do, we watched John's YouTube intros for the kind of to summarize the chapter. So that worked really well, and to kick it off.
Yeah, I brought Sooner, Safer, Happier over at my client, and it was every week 1 chapter. and there wasn't an excuse because John has the YouTube videos. So watch
Yep.
it right before, and you can contribute.
Exactly. All right, I see a question here about any luck getting folks to use Cynefin, use the language of Cynefin. If that actually is something where I am hearing that language coming through more and more with leaders and teams. You know, we've hit Cynefin from a couple different angles. A couple years ago, we had created a workshop for leaders about leading with intent that sort of blended the David Snowden idea of problem sense making with, and this might seem like a strange pairing, but we kind of paired that with sort of the David Marquet turn the ship around leading with intent. And it was for leaders to help first sort of recognize that we have these different problem spaces and how we react to it, and then think about how as leaders they can show up and support teams in new ways. And then it was reinforced through a variety of things, both Sooner, Safer, Happier, engagements with John. There's a group called Humanizing Work that we've worked with a few times that did like a leadership workshop, and they've done some product owner trainings. They talk about Cynefin. So Cynefin has come up now over the past few years, both at sort of team and leadership forums and workshops. And it actually, I won't say that now people understand it and it's being reflected in all the things that we do, but it has been encouraging to hear it come up again and again. In fact, kind of good, kind of embarrassing. We had this leadership training last week. And so our chief, Brian Tilzer, is our chief digital and technology officer. So he leads, this whole group. So it's his VPs and senior directors. And we were all together for the first time in years at this training. And as he was doing the presentation, kind of the kickoff of the session with the team, he goes, and we're in very complex times where there's a high level of unknowns, right, Neil? And I'm just like, ah. But that to me was a good signal that, this language is starting to permeate, and people are starting to think about things in those terms. Whether or not we always are able to apply that to organizational structures and systems of work yet, it certainly is something that we found to be powerful. So, I think it's a really helpful frame. All right, I think we're down to the final 4 minutes. I can't see my calendar because my work laptop's crashed, but I can see the clock. So
we are down to the final 4 minutes. So I guess, does anybody have any further questions?
What about OKRs? Do you use OKRs?
yes, we have been experimenting with OKRs for a few years now. In broad strokes, what I would say is we started in one part of the digital organization, an area where it felt like they'd been on the path of product management the longest. They had an appetite to talk about outcomes, and they were willing to try to articulate what they believed their objectives and what measures of success they might have. And we tried to do that on a quarterly basis, knowing that it's not going to totally work because the whole system isn't doing it, but could you try to do it? And as sometimes healthy organizational FOMO can go, shortly on the heels, other groups wanted to try to do it. And we're to the place now where I think there's still a tremendous amount of opportunity, and I don't believe this is exclusive to Best Buy, for more consistent outcome-based ways of articulating what the most valuable areas of focus are and how we measure success. But we do have teams that are doing their best in a quarterly and annual basis to try to use OKRs. In some areas, we have some form of laddering going on. We're in the process of exploring what kind of tooling. Goodness knows tooling is not the solution, but without tools, it can be kind of challenging to support the level of transparency that's helpful with OKRs. So we are exploring introducing a tool this year, and we are hopefully making some headway. with the broader enterprise, the broader kind of senior group to see how we might better expand the use of OKRs. So again, we experimented in one area, just doing it on a quarterly basis. More areas kind of jumped onto that. They're trying to look annually and quarterly. But I think our biggest challenge right now is just it's not like a consistent practice. So truly having the beautiful future of, we've got these nested OKRs that come from the top. We've got multi-year views and annual views. We're not quite there yet. That is absolutely our aspiration, and we're slowly working our way down. So,
Thank you.
Oh, wow. Well, I think it's time that we wrap up. So yeah, thank you so much, Neil, for sharing your agility journey with your focus on coaching and skills development. Wow, fantastic to hear your story. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today and for your great questions, participation. You will just see I've shared in the chat a Menti poll, which would be really grateful if you could just spend a moment to complete. It should only take a few seconds, really. And we will just share